If you've ever wondered whether Islam is false, you'll probably go straight for the big arguments. Maybe the contradictions in the Qur'an, maybe the Islamic dilemma, maybe the fact that Surah 930 claims Jews worship Ezra as the son of God, but they never have. Those are all very strong arguments. But today, we're going somewhere completely different. Because there's a single modern miracle, public, scientifically examined, medically analyzed, that strikes at the very heart of Islam's theology. And no, it's not a vision in the clouds or someone's cousin's uncle's friend hearing a voice in the desert. This is physical. It's documented. And if it's real, then Islam must be false. So in this video, I'm going to show you the one miracle right now in our lifetime that doesn't just challenge Islam, it directly contradicts the Quran's own teaching. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Let's get started. Before we talk about the miracle that frankly puts Islam in a theological chokehold, we need to zoom out and talk about miracles themselves, because the way that miracles function in Islam is completely different from how they function in Christianity, like not even in the same neighborhood. So in Islam, if you go searching for miracles, you're going to run into the same handful every time. Okay, Muslims will tell you that the Quran itself is a miracle, usually because of its style or its rhyme or the way that it sounds in Arabic. The problem with this argument is that it's entirely subjective. Okay, it's like calling your favorite song the greatest composition in human history because you happen to like it. Okay, but that doesn't prove to the rest of us anything. It proves nothing. Then there's the famous splitting of the moon incident, but you dig into pretty much any of the evidence and you discover that there is no contemporaneous historical documentation, no astronomical records, no independent eyewitness testimony anywhere on the planet. Not exactly ideal for a cosmic event involving the literal moon in the sky. And don't even get me started on the night journey on a flying horse. Christianity, on the other hand, has the exact opposite problem. If anything, it has far too many miracle claims. You get the biblical ones, obviously, like the healings, the exorcisms, the resurrection, but they keep going. They show up in the church fathers. They show up in medieval reports. They show up in the Reformation era. They show up in the 1800s, in the 1900s, and they show up today. And yes, not all miracle claims are created equal. Some are actually weak, some are questionable, but some, like Zaytun, which I've covered on this channel before, you can go click here if you're interested. They have mountains of eyewitness testimony, photography, documentation, government reports, and in some cases, scientific analysis. That's the key difference between these two religions. Christian miracles don't disappear after the New Testament era. They keep happening, and many come with concrete, testable data, and that is just not at all true in Islam. In Islam, the miracle claims are few, and the few that they have fall apart the second you ask for scientific, historical, or empirical confirmation. That brings us to this video, because there's one modern case, one Eucharistic miracle, where the evidence isn't just good, it's not just interesting, it's medically analyzed, blind tested, cross-checked, scientifically verified, and physically preserved. It's the Eucharistic miracle of Tixtla. And once you understand what happened there and what scientists found there, you'll see exactly why this creates a massive, unavoidable problem for Islam. What we're going to do in the next few minutes is cover some of the scientific evidence for Tixtla, and then I'll explain why this means that Islam has to be false. Now let's dive into the miracle itself. To see why Tixtla is such a problem for Islam, we need to walk through what actually happened in this location. And I promise this isn't going to be like a blur of technical vocabulary. It's going to be a story, a very strange story, a story with witnesses, with labs, microscopes, and findings that no one in that parish expected in a million years. Our story begins in 2006 during a retreat at the parish of San Martin de Tours in Tixtla, Mexico. A sister named Aurelie Meroquin was distributing communion, same as she'd done hundreds of times, but as she held one particular host, she saw something utterly impossible. A deep red substance began to emerge from inside of the host, not dripped on top of it, not like smeared on it. The color was coming from within the bread itself. She froze. Okay, she called over the priest, Father Raimundo Reina, who saw the same very thing with his own eyes. Word spread pretty quickly, as you can imagine, and by the end of the day, 17 different people had formally testified to what they saw. The host was immediately secured, was photographed and preserved. From that moment on, it was under strict custody, which means no one could have slipped in anything, switch anything out, or tamper with it without being caught. The local bishop, Alejo Zavala Castro, launched a formal investigation. Here's the important part about this, okay? He didn't rely on his parish's own people to try to verify this miracle by themselves. He brought in outside experts. Okay, in 2009, just a few years later, he brought in Bolivian-born investigator Dr. Ricardo Castellan Gomez, who had already investigated other alleged Eucharistic miracles. He brought him in to lead a full-blown scientific inquiry. Under his direction, samples were sent to a network of specialists, pathologists, and cardiologists in Mexico and the United States, forensic laboratories in Guatemala and Bolivia, and university researchers such as Guatemalan pathologist Dr. Carlos Parellada at Universidad Francisco Marroquin and American histopathologist Dr. John Campagno. So this wasn't a let's pray about it and then write a paragraph type of investigation. This was serious. Over the next several years, these scientists ran genuine medical and forensic tests on the host. Microscopy, histopathology, serology, immunohistochemistry, and DNA analysis. Many of them examined the material blind without being told it was from a consecrated host to avoid bias. And the results were nothing short of stunning. And I can't underscore this enough. This is actually really crazy stuff if this actually happened. The first major discovery was that the red substance wasn't paint, it wasn't dye or fungus or bacteria, it was real human blood. And we know that because the sample reacted only to tests designed specifically for human hemoglobin. Not animal blood, not plant material, human blood. Again, there was human blood in this consecrated host that appeared from nowhere. Under the microscope, researchers saw red blood cells, not dots, not discoloration, actual cells. And they weren't empty or dried up in the way that you expect from an old stain. Many of them were still intact. Even more surprising, scientists found white blood cells, including neutrophils and macrophages. Now, why does that matter? Okay, because white blood cells decay extremely quickly outside of the body. Again, where does this where did any of this come from? Then came the blood typing. Two independent labs, one in Mexico and another in Bolivia, determined that the blood was AB, and more specifically, AB negative, one of the rarest blood types on Earth. Even more intriguing, AB blood is exactly the blood type reported in other well-known Eucharistic miracles and the cloths associated with Jesus' passion, like the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo and others. Now, that alone doesn't prove anything by itself, but it is another bizarre data point that refuses to go away. But the most shocking discovery came when scientists looked closer at the reddish part of the host, and what they found wasn't just blood. It was human heart tissue. Now let's slow down on this because people miss the significance of this. Okay, when they examined the reddish fragment under the microscope, which you can see on the screen here, they saw the structure of myocardium, the muscle tissue of the human heart. It wasn't generic flesh, it wasn't skin, it wasn't fat, it was heart muscle. The fibers were interconnected and branching the way cardiac muscle does, and the tissue showed signs consistent, get this, with stress and even healing, like you'd expect from living damaged heart tissue under strain. Multiple experts in multiple countries independently arrived at the same conclusion. What they were looking at was myocardium from the left ventricle, the part of the heart that pumps blood to the rest of the body. And again, this wasn't just one person or one lab saying all of this. It was a cross-checked conclusion across disciplines, across borders, and across years. Now, one additional detail absolutely blew me away on this. Years after the event, when Dr. Castellan reevaluated the host, he reported that it was still perfectly tender, as soft and pliable as a freshly made host. Now, if anything else I said so far doesn't seem impossible, this should be impossible. Okay, a normal host stored at room temperature becomes rock hard, it becomes brittle or even moldy within weeks. The Tixtla host didn't do that. It retained its freshness for years. That's not like the headline miracle of all this, but it is strange and consistent feature among many Eucharistic miracles. The material doesn't behave like normal bread. After years of testing, analysis, and documentation, Dr. Castagnan and his team presented their complete findings in an 81-minute public symposium in 2013. 2 hard copies of the scientific report were handed to Bishop Zavala, one for the Diocesan Archives, and one sent directly to the Vatican Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The bishop then released a pastoral letter declaring the Tixtla event supernatural in origin, stating that it had no natural explanation and cannot be attributed to human manipulation. Notice they didn't just jump to this conclusion, right? This was at the end of a very long investigation using outside experts. But this isn't even the end of our story, because between 2015 and 2017, independent journalists, new people and researchers like Australian investigative journalist Mike Willesee highlighted additional DNA testing and helped bring the case to wider public attention. Once again, the findings lined up with the earlier results. The sample contained human DNA, but not enough to match any known individual. In other words, it wasn't from a cadaver, it wasn't from a lab tech, and it wasn't from a priest down the street. It remained, scientifically speaking, unmatched and unexplained. After reviewing everything, the final summary of the case can be stated very plainly. There is no natural explanation for this event, and it cannot be attributed to human manipulation. Just think about how wild that is for a moment. All right, that's Tixtla, a host that bled from the inside, witnesses who saw it happen, a chain of custody that prevented tampering, multiple labs, Mexico, Guatemala, Bolivia, the US, confirming human blood, rare blood type, living or recently living white blood cells, and human heart tissue, a host that never decayed, in an official church declaration that what happened in Tixtla cannot be explained by natural processes. This is not the kind of religious story that you can just sort of brush off like maybe someone saw something weird. This is a physically testable, medically examined phenomenon that forces a very tough theological question. What exactly is God saying through this? And that brings us directly to why Islam has a serious problem with Tixtla. All right, now that we've walked through the evidence, we can finally zoom in on why Tixtla is not just awkward for Islam, it's catastrophic, and it all comes down to one doctrine: shirk. Shirk is Islam's greatest theological crime. It's not murder, it's not theft, it's not oppression, not even child molestation. Those aren't as bad as shirk. Shirk means associating partners with God, worshiping something other than God, or giving divine honor to something created. And the Qur'an does not treat this shirk as like a minor spiritual misstep. It treats it as the spiritual death penalty. Okay, in Surah 448, it says outright that God does not forgive shirk. Surah 5 condemns Christians for elevating Jesus and Mary. Surah 9 attacks Christians for claiming divinity for Christ. Islam insists over and over and over that nothing is worse than worshiping Jesus. So here's the problem, if it's not obvious already. Every Christian on earth who participates in communion is doing precisely that. Regardless of theological tradition, whether you're Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant, when we receive communion, we are literally worshiping Jesus as God. Some Christians affirm the real presence, some see it more symbolically, but in every single case of communion, we are actively adoring Christ as divine. But if Islam is true, that's shirk, full stop, which makes Tixtla impossible on Islam. Because whatever Tixtla actually is, it didn't happen in a neutral setting, okay? This wasn't like God didn't perform this in the sky or on a beach or in someone's kitchen. It happened during communion, during the Eucharist, in the middle of the most Christ-focused act of worship in Christianity. A host already being adored as God suddenly transformed into something that looks exactly like Christ's sacrifice heart, complete with human blood, human tissue, and scientific confirmation. If Islam were true, this is the very last place on earth he would allow a miracle. A miracle in that context would validate, amplify, and glorify the very act Islam declares to be absolutely unforgivable. It would be God himself pouring supernatural gasoline on the fire of shirk. And keep in mind that this is just one Eucharistic miracle. In a recent interview I did, we covered 5 highly evidenced Eucharistic miracles, which you can click here and watch right now if you're interested. But the bottom line here is this. Okay, if Islam is true, Eucharistic miracles like Tixtla should not exist. It's the wrong miracle in the wrong place, producing the wrong theological message at the wrong time in history. But if Christianity is true, Tixtla makes a lot of sense. And that sets up our very next question. What could a Muslim say to escape all of this? That's where we're going next. So at this point, a Muslim might say, okay, look, Tixtla sounds very interesting, but there has to be some kind of natural explanation, right? And that's fair, okay? If Islam is true, Tixtla can certainly not be what it appears to be. So let's walk through every major escape hatch one by one and see whether any of them actually work. A Muslim might first say that the scientists involved simply misidentified what they saw. Maybe they confused bacteria for blood, or mistook artifacts for tissue, or read too much into just some sort of discoloration. The problem here is that the misidentification hypothesis requires everyone involved to be wrong multiple times across multiple labs, across multiple countries. This hypothesis requires you to believe that trained pathologists misidentified red blood cells, that immunologists misidentified hemoglobin, that hematologists misidentified the AB blood markers, and that histologists misidentified the structure of human heart muscle. And it's not like all of this is like locked away behind vague descriptions. Okay, we have actual photographs of the microscope slides from Tixtla, as you can see on the screen here, and they clearly show myocardium, striated branching heart muscle fibers, the kind that you don't get from bread discoloration or bacteria. Okay, so if that doesn't work, Muslims might move to fraud. Maybe the church just sort of like faked all of this. But this runs into an even greater wall. Okay, 17 people saw the host begin bleeding in real time during communion. The host was immediately secured. It was photographed, it was documented, and placed under strict custody. There was no window, none, for someone to just sort of like steal the host, inject it with something, or swap it out with some like pre-prepared sample. And even if you assume like this really big Hollywood level conspiracy, what exactly are they supposed to be swapping this with? To actually fake Tixtla, they need fresh, living, suffering human heart tissue that also happens to be AB blood type, already one of the rarest types on Earth. So now your fraud theory requires finding a living AB donor with active cardiac trauma, extracting tissue without anyone noticing, and then somehow getting that tissue inside of a 1 millimeter thick host. Not on top of it, not smeared across it, directly inside of it without anyone noticing. But, and this is super important, there is no possible way to insert at the microscopic level heart material into the interior of a wafer like that without shredding it or leaving obvious tool marks, especially under later forensic inspection. Fraud does not explain the data. It asks you to believe a chain of events more incredible than the miracle itself. A Muslim might retreat at this point to demonic or jinn activity. We've seen this before in some other miracle cases, claiming that this miracle was meant to deceive Christians into shirk. Now, I understand why this move feels tempting for Muslims. Okay, it lets you admit something supernatural happened while dodging the conclusion that God is actually behind it. But notice what Tixtla actually does. Okay, it doesn't distract people from Christ. It slams their face into the center of Christian worship. Adoration of Jesus is truly present in the Eucharist. Repentance, confession, deeper devotion, more mass, more adoration. So in the Christian framework, that's basically the opposite of demonic strategy. Okay, demons don't spend years orchestrating medically verifiable signs that increase devotion to Christ and confirm the very heart of their faith. And even in the Islamic frame, the message of Tixtla is catastrophically wrong for jinn to push if God is protecting his final revelation, because it publicly reinforces the very act Islam calls the most unforgivable sin. But there's an even bigger problem with the demons hypothesis if you're a Muslim. Once you say God allowed jinn to pull off a globally convincing, scientifically testable, Eucharist-centered deception, you've just detonated Islam's entire epistemic foundation, because then there's no principal reason to think God wouldn't also allow jinn to deceive Muhammad at the moment of revelation. If jinn can counterfeit a miracle at the heart of Christian worship, why couldn't they counterfeit visions in a cave? At that point, every Islamic appeal to signs or revelation or divine protection becomes suspect. You may have saved Islam, but at the cost of sawing off the branch that you're sitting on. This isn't some hypothetical worry either. Islam already has to wrestle with the satanic verses incident, where Muhammad is reported to have sort of momentarily delivered a revelation later attributed to satanic influence. You can actually click here if you want to watch my documentary on that subject. So the jinn hypothesis doesn't rescue Islam, Don't go for it, Muslims. It's not going to help you. It just multiplies the same problem into a full-scale reliability crisis. Now, the Muslims are getting desperate at this point. They're trying to find an objection that's going to actually stick. So they might offer something like this. This doesn't just refute Islam, it also refutes a lot of Christianity, right? It rules out symbolic views of the Eucharist. That rules out a lot of Christianity. They might actually be onto something on this one. Okay, hear me out. If Tixtla is authentic, if this is a genuine miracle, then low sacramental or purely symbolic understandings of communion just can't be correct. Okay, but that's not really a problem for the majority of Christians. I'm Catholic, Orthodox are going to have no problem with this. It's exactly what we would expect if the real presence is true. It's really only a problem for you if you're a Christian, if your theology predicts God wouldn't confirm the Eucharist in a Catholic setting. Finally, a Muslim might try throwing out like a handful of miscellaneous objections. Maybe the labs were biased. Maybe the bishop rushed to judgment. Maybe the church controlled the samples. None of these objections work either. The labs weren't Catholic institutions. The bishop waited 7 years before making a declaration, and the chain of custody was so tight that any tampering would have been obvious. Once all of these objections fail, we're left with the raw, stubborn weight of the evidence, multiple eyewitnesses, a secure chain of custody, scientific reports confirming human blood, rare blood type, human heart tissue, intact white blood cells, and a host that never decayed. If Islam is true, Tixtla cannot be what it is, but the evidence says otherwise. So where does all of this leave us? Well, it leaves us at the conclusion that Islam has to be false. Okay, the miracle, the Eucharistic miracle of Tixtla isn't just another interesting religious story. Okay, it isn't something that you can just brush aside with maybe someone saw something weird. Tixtla sits at the crossroads of theology, history, and hard science. It happened in a liturgical context Islam says God would never endorse. It produced physical evidence Islam says God would never allow. And after years of independent testing across borders, across labs, across disciplines, the phenomenon stubbornly refuses to collapse into fraud, misidentification, or demonic misdirection. If Islam is true, Tixtla, any Eucharistic miracle should not exist, but they do. And that's not really a comfortable thought for Muslims because Tixtla is not ambiguous. It's not a shadow on a wall or a light in the sky. It's human blood embedded in a host. It's rare blood type. It's intact white blood cells. It's cardiac tissue. It's a host that doesn't decay. And it happened right in the heart of what Islam calls the most unforgivable sin. That is a theological collision you cannot finesse your way out of. If Christianity is true, Tixtla makes a lot of sense. If Islam is true, Tixtla is impossible. Look, if you've made it this far and you appreciate the research, the production, the hours that go into content like this, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support is literally what keeps this channel alive and lets us continue exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief. Last thing, as always, Christianity is true.